That's
Okay, got another question?
Yes. No. Well, first one today, Tom. I sort of have two questions. One, current science's perception is that the universe is here, started with the Big Bang. We don't know what happened before the Big Bang, et cetera, and it sort of evolved, and we evolved, and now we're units of consciousness that have utility as avatars. I mean, this is, I'm blending now in MBT. But is it or should we look at it a different way, that our observation back in the universe, the rendering is evolving over time? I mean, if we, as human beings, we looked out at the universe and at one time saw angels dancing around, right? And we thought we were the center of the universe. And it's almost like we don't have images of what that was like, but our whole perception of the universe was different. And now we've got science that, has studied Doppler shifts, and we assume galaxies are certain distances away, and it looks like a Big Bang from the background radiation. And then we think we've got a model, and we discover, well, we only know 4% of matter, right? That 96% is dark matter and dark energy. So is the rendering evolving as we inquire, or really do we go say, well, 16 million, a billion or more years ago, there was this flash, and it went long enough, and it created these pockets?
The rendering does evolve as we go on. That's true of anything. I have an example I sometimes use, that if an astronomer looks into a space that's not been seen before, then that space gets rendered to him right then and there. Before that, it wasn't rendered because the information wasn't here. So the rendering evolves. As we stretch out and make the measurements, we get the answer. And when we get that answer, then there were many possibilities. It could have been, well, we had that random draw and that was our answer. So that's what this astronomer sees, is that one possibility that gets plucked out of that distribution is what they get to see. Now that becomes the fact from now on here. And then other people who look there will see the same thing, because now it's a historical fact that has to be taken into consideration. So in that way, yes, our universe gets rendered as we look at it. It's not there otherwise. There's just no point in calculating a universe that there's nobody to send the data to. See? Now, once that astronomer looks at it, and that's that, well, that isn't then rendered from then on. It's not like that makes it something that has to be rendered every minute of the day. That's only rendered when somebody else looks there. But now, instead of a random choice from a distribution, they'll get that choice, and then when they look at the next piece over that nobody's ever looked at, it'll have to be connected to that piece because they're right next to each other and they can't be totally different. You see, that's a new constraint now on the next piece of space that was behind it, or is nearby it. It has to be consistent with what's already there. So that's how the rendering goes. On the other hand, we have looked out at instruments. We've seen from the radiation background and other things, we've kind of put together the story of the Big Bang. All right, so we asked, we got the data. Now we're interpreting the data in terms of the Big Bang. And so far, that seems to make more sense than anything else. The thing that makes the least amount of sense about it is there can't be anything before the Big Bang. You see, because if this is all the reality there is, then this reality wasn't here to make that. It's the same thing. You can't watch yourself being born because you haven't been born yet. So there's a logical flaw in it, in that the Big Bang has to just bang out of nothing. There has to be nothing at all, and suddenly, and something out of nothing is called mysticism. So, that's why I talk about the big digital bang, where it's a simulation. So I think we've probably gathered, I don't know this for a fact, but I think we've gathered enough information to say that, all right, we've kind of decided that this is it. Now, it could be wrong. We may gather more information decades from now that says, oh, that's a lot of nonsense. There's no Big Bang. And that's a possibility too. But whatever it is, okay, it started as a digital simulation, whatever the mechanism is. And Big Bang seems like the best guess at this time. And that simulation wasn't that'd be a pretty complex rule set to put together. And my guess is that that rule set evolved as well, so that it was a cut and try. All right, I'm consciousness, and I see that it's slow going here in the growing up world because there's really no traction. We don't have a lot of feedback. We're just talking to each other. We need a reality with rules so we can have feedback. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm a computer, right? So I decide I'll make a virtual reality that people can then make choices for these avatars, and that they have traction because I can make this virtual reality with all kinds of rules that they'll have to obey. So then there's consequences and lots of decisions to make and so on. So I try to make a virtual reality, and my guess the first one probably didn't last very long. And then that probably evolved and evolved and evolved and cut and try again. Eventually they had one that is at least stable enough to produce this. Even if we do all end up as dust, a few more billions of years, I don't know, 100 billion years from now before the whole thing decays. But that's long enough to have provided what was needed. So I think it's both of those things. I think we have gotten some information. This is our interpretation. It's the best we've got now. And whatever it is, even if this is wrong and it's something else, it's a simulation. So it starts with consciousness needing a virtual reality in order to increase the rate of maturation, the rate of growing up. When you're a computer, obviously virtual reality is the only answer, and then coming up with the rule set is just a trial and error process until you finally get something that evolves to the point that you now have virtual avatars that have evolved in the simulation making choices according to that rule set that are suitable for consciousness to go in and make those choices. Before the consciousness goes in, all the players are, what do we call them, NPGs. They're all being run by the system. They're just kind of prototype players, if you will, but they're following the rules and they're making choices for some reasons that the computer gives them some ability to make choices. But they're not really conscious in the sense that they don't have an individual consciousness as a player. They have the larger consciousness system playing all of them. Well, maybe there's not that much difference because the larger consciousness system is still playing all of them as we're pieces of the larger consciousness system. But at least we've got more learning going on with that multiplicity of people with free will as opposed to just one free will doing it all is very limited than a whole bunch of free wills that mix it up and create things. So does that answer?
Yeah, I think so. Do you think the fact that now we've discovered that we know actually very little from a mass point of view, right? That 4% is what we know from the mass, and we've been pretty material oriented. That there's a whole boatload of information we still have yet to understand.
Yeah, there is.
The models are way off.
Yeah, a lot of our modeling lately is like this. We have our beliefs. We put those beliefs into equations. We look at the equations and they don't work out. Oh, the reality isn't like that. So we have two choices. We can change our beliefs or we can change the equations. So we fiddle with the equation to make it work out the way we want it to. It's called fudge factors, right? And a lot of this stuff with the dark matter and so on, basically they have these equations and they don't match. This side doesn't match that side. Well, they would if we could just add a constant over here. Well, let's call that, dark matter. So who knows how that goes? That's kind of, it's probably your best guess, but it's not really kind of firm science when you make stuff up so that you force the equations to fit. And then you say, I knew it all along. Yeah, this equation works. Well, you forced it to work. So that we tend to believe too much in we make choices, we guess at things, and then we convince ourselves that we're right. I guess that's part of what our species does, right?
Fractal nature of human beings to create new dogmas, even if it's science is a dogma, right?
Yeah.
The other question sort of is as we ponder the universe, we start wondering if there's life elsewhere. I think we've talked about this in one of the forums, I think. Another way of thinking about it is that the speed of light create the separation which allows other consciousnesses to evolve separately so we don't interact and those experiments can go on. And from your own explorations, you talked about other realities, have some of those you perceived as being in this universe, or it's too difficult to tell whether it's this universe or elsewhere?
Yes to both of those last questions. I have perceived them as being in this universe, but it's really too difficult to tell whether that's my interpretation or whether that's real, you see. And then people say, well, why don't you just ask the question? Well, it'd be hard to interpret whether the answer I got was, a good answer or not a good answer. As a scientist, I don't do things because somebody tells me, or think that things are that way because somebody tells me, and I don't believe anything. It's that sort of thing. So yes, I could ask the question, but no, I wouldn't trust it because I know how the system works, and sometimes the system gives you bad information on purpose. So anyway.
Thank you, Tom. And now I got it. I had 4 questions. Tom answered 2 of them while he was talking up there because I think he could tell I was generating the questions. So thanks for the causality.
Well, that's a real interesting question though, because we don't have to have other things populating the universe. We probably do if you look at it as, well, there's all these planets and all these suns and all this stuff. If there's that many of them, certainly the probability would be that there's something else out there. Then the big problem is, well, if they're out there, why aren't they here? Well, okay, we can't go faster than the speed of light. Physical things can't go faster than the speed of light. True enough, but that doesn't mean that you can't, settle this area, then settle the next area, then settle the next area. You can migrate. You don't have to just zip from one end of the universe to another. You can migrate around, and since we are not one of the first systems, we're kind of middle ways in the evolution of the universe as far as the age of it. So there's there's possibilities around in our universe for hundreds of millions, if not billions, several billions of years that have had a head start on us before our system ever formed. They'd been around for longer than we've been around at this point, you see. So then they figure, well, if that's the case, where are these people who migrated and finally got here, even if they are contained by the speed of light? And one answer to that, of course, would be that they don't exist. They're not there. And that this whole thing, this whole universe is here just for us, just for this learning lab. And you'd say, well, why isn't that very inefficient? You got all these stars and planets and stuff, and you're just going to waste just for this one little measly planet in one corner of the universe? And the answer to that is no, it's not inefficient because none of that stuff is rendered. It's all rendered at the point of light in the sky. That's all it's rendered. And that's not even rendered until somebody gets a telescope and points it up in the sky. So it's almost never rendered. And astronomers look, and they see something, they turn off the telescope, write up their paper, stop being rendered. They only have to render it when somebody looks at it. Remember, all the rendering is in the data stream to the individual. If there's no individual looking, there's no data stream to put the data in. So you don't render things unless somebody's looking at the information. So it's not a waste. This could be the whole game, and the rest of it is just rendered with what, 1 bit of light in the sky? Hardly takes any effort at all. And then only then a light in the sky when somebody looks. So it's not that inefficient. But who knows? Because we have also this idea that we are growing, and we look at our pattern, and we see that we started with just single bacteria. Then the bacteria make friends, right? And now we have multi-celled things because they're cooperating, lowering their entropy. And then they make multi-celled things with specialized organs because now they're cooperating even at a higher level. Okay, now here we are humans with these specialized organs, and what our job is to connect with all the other humans, make something bigger than ourselves. No, we're not going to be joined at the shoulder, to other humans, but that's not our way. Our way is to make a, what do we call it? A one world family, something like that, love, peace, everybody trying to help everybody else, that kind of thing. That's our goal. We can see it, each thing. Now, what about our next goal? Okay, let's say we achieve that, and it all is one happy family here on Earth. Is the next thing that we need to do the same thing with other people in our galaxy who have migrated here, and now we have to do that, but no point doing that till we're ready, right? All we do now would be we'll have a war with them, right? So that's our mentality at this point. So maybe, like you say, it's important not to get visitors too soon before we're ready to deal with them. So then we'd have this intergalactic thing that would have to evolve one day to be harmonious, and then move on to the next galaxy, and then these galaxies would learn, that's possible, that this just keeps going on as the systems move up the scale to bigger and better ways of being. So that's a possibility. So that's kind of got a nice ring to it, that we have a long distance here, but I don't know that that's the case. The other case could be that we're just here all by ourselves. There isn't anybody else out there. There's just us and a couple little points of light in the sky at night. That's it. And there's really no way to tell that difference. I have been places that I thought were in this universe, but that was more intuition, and by the way I got there, I kind of seemed like I stayed in this universe. It was a little different, but I have no idea how real that is, because I don't have any other corroboration, you see. It's not like you can look back and say, oh yeah, there's the Earth and the Sun. No, you're way on the other side of the universe someplace, and our solar system is nothing, not a spot, and if it was, I couldn't recognize it anyway, and so there's just no way to get any information on it. So I've had the experience, but no way to corroborate whether that's true or not true.
Well, thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, Tom. My question's around, if I can get it right in my head and say it at the same time, binaural beats and consciousness in the brain. So how mechanically could you describe binaural beats working to produce an altered state of consciousness? And I ask it because I get hung up sometimes in your books, and in many of your talks I've read that the concept of being out of body in a way is a misnomer, and that it assumes that consciousness is kind of trapped in your mind versus consciousness creating the avatar, if you will. So how does a physical stimulus like a binaural beat or even other physical stimuli can affect consciousness? Okay,
the way it does is that the avatar and all the parts of the avatar represent constraints on the consciousness. Remember we said that if the elf said, or if the player said, elf jump or fly, the elf wouldn't fly because the elf didn't have that in his rule set. Okay, so what the avatar, or what the rule set does, is put constraints on the avatar, and that then puts constraints on the consciousness. So even though the player says, fly, elf can't fly. He doesn't do that. So we, as consciousness, are working with our physical body as avatar, and our body, including our virtual brain and our virtual body, put constraints on what that consciousness can do. Okay? When you have a binaural beat, you're changing the constraint. Okay? You're lessening the constraint to being aware and being focused at a near delta level. Usually you just zip through that delta level in a hypnagogic period. You get, you're awake, you get drowsier and drowsier, and then you go. And you're not really in that little space that we want to get in very often. So what this does is it helps by putting the sound in, encouraging with the sound waves sitting there beating like this. Well, that encourages the nervous system to start getting in sync with it and firing like that, because you have all this auditory circuits that are firing with the rhythm of the beat. So your brain then is now less constrained to be in that particular area that it's in. Another way you could look at that is if you had some kind of an injury, your consciousness would have to deal with that. It has to play its avatar with whatever the constraints are that the avatar gets according to the rule set. So if you got some sort of a central nervous system disease, well, maybe you couldn't think straight, or maybe you couldn't remember who you were, or maybe you were senile or something like that. Well, the consciousness has to work with that constraint. Now, it's not that the consciousness is sick or the consciousness is senile. The consciousness is fine. It's just got an avatar that doesn't respond very well. And the consciousness then has to do whatever it can learn from that. And there's things to learn when you're in that state. So that's how the binaural beat. That's how a physical body that is really virtual can actually affect the consciousness, because it sets the constraints on what the conscious has to work with. And it's like that in World of Warcraft. When your elf jumps off a cliff and it's too high, he gets hurt. And when he gets hurt, he loses points. He gets some kind of damage. And you have to play a damaged character until you can recover. You know, until the elf gets healthy again, you play a damaged character, which is more susceptible to all sorts of things because of the damage. So that's the way it works. If you have ADD real badly, and your mind is just zinging all the time and it's really hard to focus it, your consciousness may have a hard time meditating. The conscious just may not get into that meditation state where then it has access to other things, because the access has to be through the avatar, because that's the game. You're totally immersed in that avatar. And if the avatar can't do it because they don't have whatever it takes for the rule set to do it, then you can't do it either. As consciousness, you're restricted to what that avatar can do. So you as consciousness may not ever go out of body or do any of those things because you can't settle your mind enough to focus well enough to accomplish that. Well, then you have to learn to deal with that, and consequences are instructive as well. So that's how that works. That's how physical things affect what consciousness can and cannot do.
Thank you.
Hi, Tom.
Hello.
Thank you for being so giving with your precious, valuable information.
You're welcome.
It's helped me tremendously. My question is about orbs. You know those sometimes round kind of things that we seem to be catching on our cell phone camera? Mm-hmm. I was first encountered orbs at the Monroe Institute, and so it's become one of my favorite things to do when I go there, is to see how much orbs I can catch on with cameras. So I would like to know, what's your take on orbs? What are they?
Well, it can be multiple things. One thing it can be is an entirely physical thing, in that it's just complex interaction between the light and your lenses and reflections and that sort of thing. Okay, that can make orbs. They can reproduce orbs like in a lab, where if they give you the right kind of light and the right kind of angles and so on, and there's orbs everywhere, and if they turn those lights off, the orbs disappear. So orbs can be manufactured by getting the right light and angles and so. So some of it could just be circumstance, the way you point the camera, the way the sun happens to be at that moment. Okay, that's one thing that could make orbs. Another thing that can make orbs is the larger conscious system can do all kinds of things. It's a virtual reality. If the larger conscious system wants to make some orbs on your camera sensors, not a big problem for it. It can do that. And if those orbs, when you look at them, kind of, you get excited about that, and look at that, what does that mean? And it's fun, and you get some kind of idea that reality is really strange here, because I don't see the orbs, but they show up on the film, then that's a good thing, you see. And the larger conscious system may do that just for you, because that is something that makes you happy. That's something that gives you encouragement to go on, that you're getting some experience, you see. So it could be just for you. You're that special, you see, that the larger conscious system just gives you some orbs to look at, okay? And it does that a lot. We just had a young lady come up not too long ago here, and she had earrings on, and the earrings were of a certain type and had certain patterns on them, and one day they changed. They were just different. They didn't have that on them anymore. And how does that happen? It's the same sort of thing. It's a message that says, hey, the reality is a lot stranger than you think. Or it's a confirmation. Yeah, you're right. Reality's strange, and here's the proof, you see. So those kinds of things happen a lot to people. And yours just happens to be in the form of orbs. But I'd say it's a very positive sign, because if the larger conscious system is giving you pictures of orbs, then it's aware of you and it's working with you and it finds you worth working with. And that's not true of everybody. A lot of people just aren't ready for that. They can't grow from it, so they don't get that sort of thing, you see? So that's good. Now, if it's just sun and camera angles and reflections inside the lens, well, that's life. I don't know.
They seem,
It's hard to say.
when I'm there, you know, at nighttime, a bunch of us will get together and we'll go out and call the orbs.
Mm-hmm.
And they seem to come.
Yeah.
So I guess this is the larger consciousness
Sure.
system answering our requests.
Sure.
They show up.
Yeah. If you were the larger conscious system and you saw this bunch of people and they were all real cute and they were sitting there in a circle and they were calling, "Here, Orby, 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 Orby," wouldn't you give them some orbs? Yes, of course, you'd give them some orbs, because they probably are all of the same mind that would delight them and would help them find evidence to the fact that world is a bigger place than just the physical. So sure, you would do that. You'd doubly do that if that was the case, if you had a bunch of people, because now you get, 3 or 4 birds with one stone. That would be a good thing for the consciousness system to do. It does that sort of things all the time. Yeah, and the more you're open to it, the more it'll happen. And if you're closed to it, it doesn't happen, because there's no sense giving people things that they can't process. So part of it is your attitudes that you come there with. And if you had a bunch of people that said, "This orb stuff's a bunch of nonsense, what does it matter with these people? Come on, Orby, Orby, where are you?" And they never get anything, you see, because they're not worth the trouble. Because if you do, they'd say, reflection inside my camera, it was nothing. They'd blow it off because they're not open to it. So yeah, system will do that sort of thing. Now, could orbs be something else, some sort of thing that you can't see that shows up on the film or whatever? It's possible. Who knows?
I think so.
Almost anything's possible. I wouldn't say that, that's an impossibility. This is a digital system. Almost anything's possible. There's very few things that are a zero in the probability curve. There's just things that are more likely than others. But that doesn't mean that one of those things that's unlikely isn't what's happening. You see, so you have to keep an open mind, and you have to be skeptical. And that means if you do that, you have to live with uncertainty. We don't really know what those orbs are, and that has to be okay. They're just fun, and you go do them, and it's a good thing.
Thank you. Would you be willing to give us a little bit more information about your theory of primal man, primal woman?
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about that. Well, basically, if we look at how our instincts developed, we as a species, okay, we developed similar to some critters, but had kind of our own special ways of doing things. Now, evolution is one of these things that it's not a plan that you sit down and make. Things happen, and if they work, they go on, and if they don't work, they don't go on. It's that kind of a thing. Well, we had one breakthrough, I'd say, in our evolution that made a big difference in what kind of animal we became. And that was that we discovered that if you have a division of labor, if you have specialties, if you specialize in certain things, you can be a lot better at what you do than if you don't specialize. In other words, everybody does everything, right? Henry Ford found that out too. He was the assembly line first guy that figured that out. If you have a whole bunch of people who get really good at doing a small thing, you can make cars a lot faster than if it's just a whole bunch of people, each group's making car from the ground up. Doesn't work nearly as well. Well, in evolution, there were other competitors in the hominid family that didn't make it, okay, like Neanderthal. In Neanderthal, if you look at the skeletons, they're both about the same size. We don't have males much bigger than females. And the idea is that they seem to be very egalitarian in the sense that everybody seemed to do everything. They both could do all the tasks. They were physically pretty much the same, so everybody did everything, and that didn't work out so well for them. It's much better if you specialize and then the specialists team up. So what happened in humans is that we split the jobs to do, and there was just a couple of jobs that needed to be done for us to procreate and survive. One of the jobs was we need to have children, and we need to take care of them so that they survive, at least survive long enough to procreate themselves, right? That's how the race keeps going on, okay? The other job that we had was we had to take care of those children and the women that were having those children and make sure that they and those children survived to go on. So we had two specialties then. We had the women who bore the children, took care of the children, and lifespans back in those days were about 35 years is their best guess. You know, you didn't live to be real long at those times. So in 35 years, you, as a female, would be pregnant and having babies most all the time. You know, there wasn't birth control, there wasn't lots of other things. There probably wasn't even any knowledge of, you know, connection between sex and having children. May not have been figured out for a long time. They probably figured that out after fire, you know, not before. But anyway, you know, we're talking about millions and millions of years, right? So at the time when these programs, our instincts were written, we decided to split up the duties, and that worked really well. So while the women were pregnant most of the time, had a bunch of children around, and had to, you know, make sure that they all grew up, the males had the job of protection and resourcing, providing. They had to find the place to sleep, they had to find the food, they had to bring home the bacon, you know, as it said, and they had to protect this family, because if this family didn't survive, then their genes didn't get passed either. You know, they didn't survive because their genes got passed through their children. So you have this division of labor, and women were smaller because you didn't need bigness to do what they did, you see? And no sense wasting calories when food is scarce on a job that doesn't need all that much calories. The men got bigger because they had to be the protectors, and they had to be the ones that brought home the bacon. So they're the ones that had to wrestle the tiger, you see. So they got bigger, women got smaller, and they worked together in that way. The man was dominant in the outside job, which is out into the world. The woman was dominant in the inside job, which is basically relationship things, people connections. So we did that, and for lots of years, that was a good model. And we've gone from, you know, millions, several million years where that seemed to work well for us, because by doing that, we had more time now for the children to grow up, because they had a specialist in child rearing there taking care of them. You see, out in the animal world, when new babies are born, they grow up fast, because if they don't, they're somebody else's sandwich. They don't last long. So when you birth a puppy in 6 months, that puppy is 80% of his size and fully capable of running as fast as any of the other of them, you see. Well, they have to go fast. Well, when you have a specialist that's whole job is to take care, now that can slow down a bit. When that slows down, you got more development time, then we start having bigger brains. The brains get more developed because there's more time to do that. You don't have to grow up so fast. You got a lot of time for that intricate wiring to take place. So that helped us develop, make us different than, we're just not another species of chimpanzee. You see, we're different as humans because of how we evolved. There are other things that go along with that, but you know, so we have this male and female as teamwork, basically, to propagate their genes forward, which is what the whole idea of evolution is, that you propagate your genes forward. Now, what happens is we take this model and we roll it up to about 300 years ago, and it worked fine, and it was stable, And generally, everybody was pretty happy with their role because it worked really well. You had two teammates that were much better than either one of them could be by themselves, and much more successful at getting their genes passed along than either one could be by themselves. And then about 300 years ago, the world started to get a little kinder and a little gentler. And now we find ourselves where a lot of our instincts that we developed from that time don't play out so well. You see, the ladies don't have to wrestle tigers anymore, you know, in that outside world. They can join in that outside world. They don't need so much protection and provisioning that they used to. So we got a very profound change in the environment. The way evolution works is that you adapt to an environment. Well, we've got instincts from millions of years of evolution, and we've got an environment that's different in the last eye blink of evolution than it has been for many millions of years. Because 300 years out of many millions is just a flash in the, you know, it's very, very current. It's like a drop in the bucket as far as time goes. So it's just been in the last second or two of our evolution that we've had this major change in environment. And we're having a lot of trouble adapting to that change. So what the book does is it looks at these instincts in a lot more detail than whatever than I've just given, because can't take too long on this because there's other people with other questions, but that's kind of basically it. We've got these instincts, and what are we at the instinctual level? What really does it mean to be male or to be female? And what is it that we have to do? Because if we don't act in consonance with our instincts, we get stress. We get unhappiness. We feel unfulfilled. We feel like we're not doing it right. We feel like failures. We have a hard time dealing with not doing the things that we were evolved to do. See? So that creates problems for us because our environment changed. And, you know, evolution's slow. It may take us another, you know, 1,000,000 or 2 years to adjust. Well, hopefully not, right? That'd be a long time of people being miserable and being confused about gender roles and who they are and what they're doing and why they're doing it. And we're going to do that for millions of years. So I think we can probably do it in 3 or 4 generations if we really understood the problem and really could see what the issues were and really could make intelligent choices rather than just struggling with everything as it, you know, as it falls upon us. So that's the point of the book, is to put this information out there so that people have an idea of who they are at the root, at the instinctual level, and why they feel the way they do about the things they feel. And then I think we have a higher probability of making intelligent choices, because we have to find a way to work with our instincts. If you cross-purpose them, it's just, you're not going to feel right. I mean, it doesn't matter how successful you are or how much money you make or anything else. If you don't feel like you're really being who you need to be, that you're not really serving those instinctual needs, you will feel unfulfilled. You'll feel unhappy. It won't be what you want to do. You'll feel like there's something wrong here. You see? So if we're going to be happy, then we need to understand it. Now, it doesn't mean we're a slave to our instincts. We need to change, to evolve to our new environment. But we've got to be careful. We don't want to do quick, because this environment may change. We may be, you know, back in the Stone Age. You know, who knows about that, right? That's a possibility. You know, we could regress. And in that case, we'd be right back where we were, and then we'd need those instincts, and we wouldn't have, I just got rid of those, you know. Now where are we? So evolution is slow that way, because, you know, things come and go. At evolution's viewpoint, this is just a flash. So if we understand it at least, we won't be so frustrated, and we won't feel so empty, and we won't feel so, what is going on here? You know, why doesn't this seem to work? And we'll understand it, each other better. And instead of men saying they just don't understand women, and women saying, those men, I don't get it, understand each other. And we see why we're that way, and we see why we're different. See, we're very, very different. Men and women view the world totally differently. We see the world differently. We interpret it differently. We have different sets of interests. It's just completely different because we specialize to do the things we do. Women are really good at relationship. They get it with relationship and networking and that thing, right? And they're good with children. And the men are good at provisioning and protecting. That's what they're supposed to be good at. And if they don't do that, they feel unfulfilled. The women don't do what they have their instincts, they don't feel fulfilled. See, that's kind of where we are, and I think we need a little clarity about just what are these instincts, and what is it that we're feeling, and what is our cultural overlay that now kind of warps those instincts, because a lot of times the culture and the instincts don't go together either. The culture says you need to be this way, and that's really not the way you are down deep. Now you'll have to live something other than the way you are, and that doesn't leave you happy either. So it's just an understanding. I just saw kind of a big need here where there's a lot of confusion, that I would try to settle some of that confusion. So that's really what it's about, is looking at who we are. You know, if you look under the hood at male and female, what do you find? And you'll find two different animals all together that have been programmed genetically to do certain kinds of things and have certain kinds of attitudes and to see the world in certain ways. And those two ways really work good together. And they have for millions and millions of years. Now there's some strain and some stress because the environment's not the same as it was when all those instincts were created. It's a different world now, and it needs us to learn how to be different. But we have to make that turn gracefully. Right now we're not making that turn at all. You know, we're just struggling with the issues that we don't understand. Instead of gradually turning into a different way of being, we're just slamming against the wall, you see, and not turning. So that's the problem, and that's what the book's trying to help. So.
Well, I'm looking forward to your book. Thank you.
You're welcome. And you know, when I talk about this, I'm really just talking about the experience that most of us have, what I call under the fat part of the curve. You know, these probability curves, they have kind of outliers. There's not too many people there. And then they have this big fat part of the curve, and most of us fall under that. That's where the averages are. But you have all these other things too. So it's not like all men are this way and all women are that way. You can't say that at all. You know, you have women that go from one end of this to the other, and you have men that go from one this to the other. But under the fat part of the curve, where most of us are, this is pretty much the way it is. So this book is really written for those under the fat part of the curve, because that's where the big mass issue is. Now, for the people that fall out under the other end of the curve, that's just the way statistics plays out. It's not that these folks are somehow ill or something's wrong with them or it's a problem. This biology thing has a lot of different things, the way it can come out. You know, all of these chromosomes and things, genes go together, and out comes a child, and the mixture is 1 in a couple of billion of what you get. And occasionally, what you get is out under these curves. You get a kid that's playing Chopin and Beethoven when he's 3 years old, or you get homosexuals, or you get other kinds of things where you have a man in a woman's body and a woman in a man's body. They just feel wrong, and this stuff just comes out as, you know, stuff that's not under the fat part of the curve. And it's just part of that random draw of all the possibilities, the way this stuff can go together, it comes out. So most of that is just, they're just different. It's not a worse or a better or anything. They're just exactly like us, except they're different than us, because us are the fat part of the curve. We're the majority. And that's just because of the way the probabilities run. So I'm not talking about every woman and every man. I'm basically talking about those of us under the fat part of the curve, because that's where the big problem is. People also have issues of their own, but they're kind of special to their own attitudes and the way they see the world, because they see the world differently. You see? So that's this kind of thing. You can't say anything about all women. You know, all women are this or that, or they feel this way, or they need this and that, or here are their instincts. No, these instincts are, most women feel these instincts. Some women feel them more strongly. Some women feel them more weakly. Same with men. You see? So it's all a a continuum, and then there's things that aren't under the fat part of the curve at all that go on. But my book isn't addressing all of that. Maybe a chapter or something on that, just to explain that it's, no different than we are. They just, the probabilities just went together differently. And that's just the way they are. And diversity is good, because every time you get somebody else that sees the world in a different way, that gives you opportunity to learn something and grow. Diversity is a very good thing. So we should celebrate all of us, however it is that we are. And that's kind of the deal. But I wanted to say, I'm not really saying that all men are this way or all women are that way, because people will be all over me as soon as I say that. I wanted to clarify that. I'm just talking about the way most of us feel, because that's where the big clash is. There should be no war between the sexes. That's wrong, and it's destructive of men, and it's destructive of women. And we're destroying ourselves, and if we don't figure out how to do this gracefully, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. If we do figure it out, hopefully it can get better, and we can learn to live peacefully with our instincts in a way that we feel satisfied and fulfilled, and still get to express ourselves the way we are as fully as we can in this environment that we're in. There are ways to do that. And part of the book is going to be, well, okay, what are the solutions? What are the things that we can do? How do we need to think? How do we need to see the problem to find a better way out of it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Tom. First of all, thank you for putting on this playground here. It's been a real pleasure, and making yourself so accessible to all of our questions, especially mine. The one thing I was wondering about was, I haven't completed all your trilogy yet, so you may have answered this someplace in there, and bear with me if you have. What's to prevent the larger consciousness system from just taking information it has, and it's, from what I've read so far, it's operating already at magnitudes higher speed than we are in this reality. So there's a couple consciousness levels higher, and each one is operating at magnitudes higher of speed. So and resources, obviously. They had more consciousness, more digital work area, basically. So what's to prevent this higher consciousness, as far up as it goes, taking the data it has and just extrapolating what all the possibilities are for humans or whatever else other realities it wants to create, and just run them as a reality game in its own mind? I mean, why does it need to project a consciousness into a virtual reality and go for lower entropy and all that? Why does it care about that?
Okay, it cares about lower entropy because it's an information system, and you want to lower the entropy of the information. Okay, now, yeah, it's a similar question, is why doesn't the larger conscious system that is much more evolved than we are just duplicate itself? It's already there. So why do we have to climb up this, this rope to get there? What's the point? Well, the point is, think of it this way. Let's say there's a book, and this book tells us marvelous things that help us grow up. Okay, now let's say this book is available to everybody, or could be available to anybody who wants it. Well, the way you lower entropy is for somebody to read this book and then grow up because of it. You don't lower entropy just by duplicating the book. In other words, you can take a book and you can run it through a duplication, you make a whole pile of books. You can make 10 books for every person. That doesn't lower the entropy much. Entropy has to be lowered by consciousness making a choice, not through duplication. So it's not that the system has to have a certain absolute value of entropy, because then it could just duplicate itself. So, take the highest 10 cells and, make everything just like them. That doesn't really lower entropy. That just takes them and it lowers the entropy in an absolute sense, but you're not changing entropy. They don't have any real growth for that. Where you have growth is when people make choices and they learn from those choices and they grow up. So it's not It's not the absolute value of entropy you reach that's important, it's the change. It's the change in entropy that you get. It's the fact that you're reducing it. And you know, like everything else, you know, the second law of thermodynamics applies to pretty much everything. If you don't work at it, you lose it. You know, it's the use it or lose it principle. So if you say you grow up and you lose a lot of your fear and you lose a lot of your ego and you feel like you've kind of arrived and you kick back and you just don't work at it anymore, you'll start de-evolving. And in a year or two, you'll have all sorts of ego that you thought you didn't have anymore. You'll just backslide. It's something you need to constantly put energy in to keep that entropy decreasing. Entropy doesn't decrease on its own, it increases on its own. That's why you take a battery and you never use the battery, but eventually it just goes dead by itself. Everything does that, everything dissipates. So does the entropy in consciousness, it dissipates. So what you need is something that's constantly changing its entropy. It's entropy change that's more important than entropy absolute value. So that's why it's like that. It's not that the system just wants the highest absolute value. It's just the system needs individuals to change, to grow up, and that's what raises the system. That's what keeps the chaos at bay. You know, that's what keeps the system working. And we are that system. You see, this system exists at every level. We can't think of the larger conscious system as this high and mighty, godlike system that knows everything. We're it. We're part of that system. So it's got an executive level, no doubt, but it's the whole thing. So we chug along at lowering that entropy because that's the only way for that entropy to decrease, is if you work at it. It doesn't decrease just because you duplicate it. If you duplicate it, you just make more of the same. And more of the same, and eventually that more of the same will start to decay and dissipate. What you need to do is work to get rid of it. So it's in the process, it's not in the goal. It's the process we go through that's important. The goal, it's a goal we'll never reach. This thing of entropy reduction, it's not like one day we'll all get there and be done. It's not like, wow, I got my entry to 0, you know, I'm done now, I don't have anything else to do. That isn't the thing. We're not headed toward that as a goal. So we will be on this entropy reduction treadmill, I would say, for as long as anybody can foresee. I hate to say words like forever because they're like infinity. You know, you never get the forever. It doesn't exist. It's just an idea. But it doesn't really end. The system isn't done. The system is still evolving. It's still figuring things out too. And we're figuring them out at our own level. Just like the dogs and cats are still figuring things out, but they're figuring it out on their own level. So it's not like we just get rid of all the dogs and cats because they're not pulling their weight. In the consciousness reduction game, you know, you need you can express consciousness at all sorts of levels, and all the levels working at the same time to change. So it's not how fast can you get there, it's not how far can you go, it's keep working. Keep working at it. It's your individual growth. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
well,
that's...
It does fairly well, yeah. The other question I had was the individual consciousness units, when we stop playing this game and jump out of our avatar, basically, go back to the one consciousness. Do we retain our individuality? I know we don't retain our personality, and our memories basically fade away. And
Right.
so we're still an individual consciousness unit.
Right.
Do we have like a barcode, and they put us on a shelf and then
Yeah, we
reactivate
retain.
us sometime?
Yeah, we retain our individuality. We're individuated units of consciousness. Okay, and we stay that way, and we grow. We collect all this information, all our choices, and we grow up and lower our entropy. And we have this free will awareness unit that's like a piece of the larger consciousness system. It goes out, gets immersed with an avatar, makes choices, right? And all that learning comes back to this individuated unit of consciousness. So when that avatar dies, now there's a gradual process of that free will awareness unit kind of becoming back connection with its with its individuated unit of consciousness. And you may say that the free will awareness unit kind of dissipates because the individuated unit of conscious is getting all that data all along in a data stream. It's not like it's stored up in the free will awareness unit. So that free will awareness unit kind of dissipates. It kind of returns, if you will, the consciousness to the larger thing, to the parent. And then the parent is the one that negotiates the next incarnation, really. It's not the old personality. It's the individuated unit of consciousness does the negotiation for where it goes next. And then once it gets an avatar, it kind of logs in to the game, and we start the process again. It takes a piece of itself to be the free will awareness unit, and that gets connected to the game. So that's kind of the way it's played. But that individuated unit of consciousness remains its identity at that individuated unit of consciousness. It's the only one that has had all of this specific experience. Everyone has a different collection of experience, and it integrates all that experience and tries to learn what it can from it. So it stays that way. So it's not melting back into the one thing entirely. The free will awareness unit does kind of do that, but that's all right. That was just manufactured just for that game. So that's sort of the way that works, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, so over time, it seems to me that there would be animal, anything that had an individual consciousness, all accumulated as individual units back in this ocean of consciousness, so to speak. What's everybody doing? I mean,
yeah, that's the way it works. But you always have new consciousness coming in at the end. It's not a closed system. If you have a closed system, you just have n individuated units of consciousness, and then we just wait, and those n maybe grow up, and the system grows up with them. But there's always new individuated units of consciousness coming into the system. So you've got some that have been around 1,000 times, and you've got others that have been around twice, or this is their first time, and you got all of that mixed together, and it keeps that way. New will come in. So it's just like in a school. You got the seniors graduate, and a new bunch of freshmen come into the other end. So the schoolhouse is constantly active and full of energy. So it's not just a closed system. Yeah, it's open. Otherwise, if it were closed, then eventually we'd all get about as far as we could get and kind of go asymptotic. But as long as you have new stuff coming in, then it's a live system.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Extremely hypothetical question. Ghosts, okay? If they would exist, why would an individuated unit of consciousness want to roam a virtual plane where it's not connected to an avatar? And why would there be no checks and balance from the higher consciousness to say, wait a minute, this isn't right, get that out of there?
Well, for the last part, there's free will, so you get to do what you want, and nobody will tell you to get out of there. For the most part, the ghosts phenomena is in the mind of the beholder, as opposed to out in the haunted house. It's the mind of the beholder that sees the ghost, and people who are interested in ghosts tend to see ghosts, and people who don't have any interest in it, whatever, they never see any ghosts. So it's not so much that you have these, what do we call them, discarnate beings wandering around with chains on their legs and moaning and whatever else ghosts are supposed to do. It's that becomes a metaphor for some people as far as the energy that they see or the data that they get or what they imagine. It's not necessarily all their imagination. They may be getting energy data, and that's the way they perceive it. Well, why would it exist at all? I don't know. We have a lot of beliefs here. As humans, we tend to be pretty strong believers in lots of things. And when you believe in something, you often create it. Just like when you're afraid of something, you often create it. So beliefs also go from mind to mind. We're connected mentally. So you'll probably find these things kind of in groups of people. And this whole group always sees ghosts. This group sees aliens or whatever else. Well, there's a lot of connectedness between people. And we see things together. And sometimes there's a group of 10 and all of them see it except 1 or 2, and they say, well, I didn't see anything. Well, they're not as connected to that group, or they got it but didn't interpret it that way. They hadn't drunk all the Kool-Aid yet. So that's mostly what it is. So it's not that it's fake in the sense that they're just making it up. They may be getting some kind of data that then they're interpreting the way they interpret it. But we're very creative people, and we can modify all sorts of probabilities around where there's enough uncertainty. So if we decide that this is a haunted house and we're going to go in there and see the lady that used to live in there a century ago, and particularly if there's several of us doing this together, we may raise the probability of that happening enough that we all see it. We might even get a picture of it, you see? And it's not that it didn't happen. It's just that it's not necessarily some lady, dragging her chains and moaning. It may be just an intent with a lot of uncertainty in a situation where 4 or 5 people experience something very unusual, which doesn't really it breaks the rules a little bit, but only to 4 or 5 people, and besides, nobody will believe them anyway, you see. So you have plausible deniability. The system doesn't mind that kind of rule breaking where there's plausible deniability. You can do all sorts of things, like the earrings that changed, the pattern on them. See, there's plausible deniability. The person says, oh, look, my earrings just magically changed. And everybody goes, right, yes, sure they did. You just never really looked at them closely, did you? That sort of thing, because there's plausible deniability. So that kind of thing, kind of a wake-up call, or a yes, you're right kind of call, they can happen, and the same thing can happen with ghosts. So wherever there's randomness, intent can manifest all sorts of things. So I think you probably start with a bunch of people who believe in ghosts, and believe that there's a ghost in that particular place, and now the probability's just gone way up that that's what they'll find, even if before it was not too likely. And the person that has no interest in it and couldn't care less, he goes into the house and finds nothing of interest, you see. So that's why you have some people go in and they say, we get in there every night and there's always a ghost doing this. So then the film crew comes in and says, okay, let's take a picture of your ghost. Where is he? Well, he doesn't show up that night, you see. That's why you have that kind of thing. It's very problematical. And it's not that the people are making up stories. They did see this, what they saw, what they said they saw, they're being honest enough, but it doesn't mean that it's what they interpret it to be.
I'll have to get with a group of people who believe we can hit the lottery.
Yeah. You probably won't be allowed to do that.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question about rule sets. You said earlier you said it's difficult to come up with a stable rule set that will work. Mm-hmm. Does the greater consciousness ever upload new rule sets or change rule sets? And is there any evidence that we have here of that happening?
The rule set isn't absolutely unchangeable, but the rule set is a pretty complicated set of balancing things and it's been developed with just the right constants and everything else so that it's stable. There's not a lot of tweaking you can do with that and still keep it stable. There's a whole set of physical constants. I don't know whether the scientists have some name for this, but there's a whole bunch of these physical constants that if you change any one of them in the 5th decimal place, this whole place dissolves. It just doesn't work. It's not stable anymore. So those were I'm sure, evolved to be exactly the way they are because it all balances. So the rule set can't really be tweaked and jerked around too much as far as what it generally requires of people and the restrictions it puts on us. But that doesn't mean that in the privacy of your own home or with your friends, you can't levitate a box of rocks 3 feet off the floor. You might be able to do that. You see? Now you're breaking the rule set. That's all right. You're not breaking it in front of very many people. Nobody's going to believe you anyway. So there's this deniable, plausible, it's plausible that you're making it up. That's what most people will think. So in that case, the system doesn't mind to let you break the rule set, because in doing that, you've spent hours and hours and hours in meditation. You've done all sorts of things. You've done all this stuff that's really pretty good for you, and your reward is to watch the box of rocks float. You see? Well, that's not a bad carrot, hold in front of that donkey. That works pretty good. So the system doesn't mind, floating a box of rocks for you if that's what you've been working on, if it's been very valuable for you and you're growing. Now, if it hasn't been very valuable for you and you're growing, it's probably not going to happen. So that's, the rule set can be violated in small amounts where there is enough uncertainty to cover that there was ever a violation at all. So that's how we can break the rule set. So I don't think the rule set in general is going to change, but the ways that we break it, yeah, that'll change from time to time. And how much are we allowed to break it? This psi uncertainty principle, which is that you have to have plausible deniability, you see, there's a reason for that. We're not ready yet to, en masse, understand how reality works. Okay, we can modify future probability with our intent. It wouldn't be a very nice place to live if everybody understood that at a deep level. You'd have all of the people now who are trying to manipulate each other to be the way they want, all using intent to modify the probabilities and see who could, force their free will on somebody else's free will using their intent. Well, that's what you got going on over in coastal Africa. Those that come from those areas know that, the using the intent to inflict harm or to do good, it's a way of life. It's just the way it is there. And generally, it's not a good thing. People who aren't grown up enough to do that can abuse it. You can use your mind to heal, you can use your mind to hurt. So until you have people grown up enough that they can handle that sort of a responsibility, you just assume they don't know that they can use their mind to hurt or to heal. So there's limitations on that rule set. What you can do with it, how you can violate it, and what the system will support or won't support. Now, different reality frames have slightly different rule sets. They've just evolved a little differently. Many of them are fairly similar. You can see some glaring differences, but a whole lot will be similar, and that's what I said before. I think it's just hard to come up with a lot of different rule sets that all work. It's a very intricate balance of forces and things that makes something this stable. It's a difficult thing to achieve, but I'm sure there's more than one solution. This isn't the only rule set. I've been places that are quite different than this. It's not the same rule set. You get a totally different rule set when you dream. Dreaming is another reality, just like this reality. It just has a different rule set. And another really neat thing about the dreaming reality is that your intellect finally sits down and shuts up. When you're in a dream reality, everything you do is from the being level. So if you're in the dream reality and you say, wow, I'm really a nasty person in this dream, I'm glad I'm not really like that. Well, that's your intellect that thinks you're really not like that, because you really are like that, or you wouldn't be doing that in that dream reality. That's your core being. What you do in those dreams is who you really are at that level. Now, once your intellect takes charge of a dream, it's no longer a regular dream, it's a lucid dream. Now your intellect is in charge. But until you get lucid, you just respond out of the being level. And that's what's so valuable about it, is because you can't trick yourself there. Here you can convince yourself of all kinds of things about how wonderful and neat you are. But when you're in the dream reality, the way you interact with things is just the way you are. I don't know if that's good news or bad news. I see some people doing this and some people doing that. Yeah. But in any case, that's what's good, and you're there to learn. See, it's another learning place. So when we're not dreaming, we're working in this reality. When we're not working in this reality, we're working in that reality. It's just that's the way it is. Everything you do, awake or asleep, conscious or not, you're making choices somewhere, in some venue. You know, you're generally occupied. And there may be little bits of delta sleep, but that's not true. But basically, you work all the time.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Sort of. Well, except for one bit.
Okay, what was the one bit?
Well, I feel like a 5-year-old, but what about dinosaurs?
Yeah, what about dinosaurs?
Well, I don't know that they exist now because they're way too big to
Could they exist
live.
now?
I mean, yeah. I mean, well, I've always heard that dinosaurs are too big to live under the gravitational force that we currently have.
No, I don't think so.
No?
No.
Oh.
I think gravitation isn't the issue with dinosaurs.
Okay.
Dinosaurs were big, which means they had to eat a whole lot to maintain those huge bodies. And if food gets scarce to the point that they can't eat a whole lot, they starve to death. So they were only here for as long as they had something to eat. When they didn't have anything to eat, they disappeared. And they're not likely to come back, because if they did, we'd shoot them, you see. Because we hairless monkeys have taken over, and we've got weapons now. So we're not going to let them chase us around.
Okay, thanks.
Good evening. Hello. I have a question about an experience that Bob Monroe said he had. And I was wondering if you had a similar experience, and if so, if you could elaborate on it.
Okay.
He stated that he proceeded to approach what he called the great remitter, and he was told that he could not go forward until he collected his parts. And I was wondering if you had a similar experience, and if you could tell me what it means to collect your parts. Is that actually a way of evolving your consciousness?
Did you say the great emitter?
Emitter. I'm sorry.
Emitter?
The great emitter.
I don't really remember that. I've read, of course, Bob's books. I don't really remember that, but I can still comment on it pretty much.
You call that going through the aperture.
Yes, okay. You interpret the data you get in terms of your beliefs, your fears, and your knowledge. Okay. Now, Bob was a very experienced traveler, but he carried his own beliefs and with him as he did that. He was not, he did not see it as his interpretation of the data. He saw it as that's what was there. And that's the way it is with most people. Until you understand it's a virtual reality, you think that what you see is what's there. So if you report something, then that thing was like that there. Well, as it turns out, that everywhere in this reality as well as the out-of-body reality, what you see is how you interpret the data. We know that. A lot of people see the same thing and interpret it very differently. So it's just the way that works. Everything that you have experienced is your own personal interpretation of what happened. And you don't know that anything else happened different than the way you interpret it, you see? So to us, it's just real, but actually it's just an interpretation. So Bob had some of his beliefs that then he had to deal with when he was out of body. Like one time he got to a wall, couldn't get over it, couldn't get around it, couldn't get under it, he was stuck. It upset him, it scared him, because how could he get back? Well, that was an experience he had that was playing out a fear that he had of not being able to get back. Is that a possibility? Well, in general, he didn't let that fear bother him too much, but there it was, and there it was manifested as that wall, you see. So you have to read most books about out-of-body and out-of-body experiences. You have to read them like between the lines. It's not so much what happened, but it's why it happened. You have to do the same thing with dreams. you don't look at dreams for the literal thing. You look at dreams for the content of why that's happening. What are the connections? What are the metaphors that make sense here? You see, so Bob had this thing that he couldn't get past this point because he wasn't ready. Okay? Because he felt inside that he had more work to do, that he wasn't quite ready. It was kind of a, well, you got to keep working. You're not done yet, kind of a thing that he got. And then he interpreted that as, got to the orifice and they said, no, you can't come in yet. You know, you get to the pearly gates and Peter says, not yet, you know, you're not ready here, you know, go back to the operating table, you know, wake up. We're not ready for you. So it's a similar thing. So don't take that too literally, but rather see it for the content it is and the metaphor that it is. These things are metaphors. So the metaphor had to do with not being ready, still having more to learn, and you can see that a metaphor for things you have to learn are like things you have to go out and gather. Oh, I've got to gather this knowledge, this information. So you can see how that might come out as get all my parts. You see? So if you see the metaphor, and then it all kind of makes sense and pulls together. And it's not just that when you're out of body, you have to interpret what you see. You always do that. Everything. Here, any reality. You only, what you get. That's why I say, you know, well, I saw something that looked, you know, like this. Is that really what was there? I have no idea. That was my best interpretation. Stay skeptical all the time because you don't really know what was there. And there's no way for us to experience that source, you see. There's no direct experience of the source of the data. All you ever get to see is the data, never the source. So you never actually get the ground truth behind the data is impossible because you're a consciousness, and what you do is you receive data. You don't receive sources. You just get data. So that's why you have to always be skeptical of everything. And most of the explorers in out of body don't really understand that notion about reality that applies to all realities. And so what they see is what they report. This is what I saw. And in their mind, that's exactly what was there. But it's a metaphor. Dreams are metaphors. Actually, this life we live here in this physical reality is metaphors. It's still the same. We interpret things based on our own experience. And the fact that we think this reality is somehow fundamentally there, it's not. Data streams in our mind is all it is. It's like that reality the elf lives in. Is that reality fundamentally there? It's just data streams out to the players. That's all it is. Take the players away, there is no reality. This reality is data streams to us. We create this reality in our head. Our consciousness creates this reality. That's how it can be a virtual reality for us, but it seems so real. And out of body seems just as real as this. When you're out of body, everything can be just as clear as this is. It's in a dream, everything is just as real as this. They're all metaphors in our interpretation. So there's lots of out-of-body books that describe that, and most of those are real experiences. Bob did indeed experience just what he wrote about. That was his experience. He just didn't see it as a metaphor. Everything's a metaphor. This experience, you see, is also like that. Everybody here is going to walk away with a different reality of what happened here. Everyone is going to have their own version of what this was, what I said, what it meant. It's going to be different for everyone. Certain parts you'll agree with, but a lot of things you'd say, really? That happened? I didn't get that at all, you see? Everybody's going to have a different reality here. We think we're all living in the same fixed reality, but we're not. We're all living in our own personal reality. So that's the difference. So when you read Bob's books and all the other books about out of body, read them with the idea they're talking about metaphors, and that's their interpretation. And that's one of the reasons why I don't talk about my experiences. You see? There's not much reason to do that. That's my metaphor. And if I tell you my metaphor, now you get in that state, you expect to see what I said because you think that's what's there. And now I've just made it harder for you to actually come to your own reality. I just made it difficult for you. So there's no point in that, you know. And Bob did that unintentionally with his park. He had a park. He went and relaxed, and when he was out of body, one of the things he'd do is go to his park, and you know, it had trees and a nice lawn and all these kinds of things. And people still, you know, trying to go to Bob's park. Well, that was Bob's park. And why did it have trees and the grass? Because to Bob, that was a relaxing environment. Somebody else's relaxing environment is totally different. The woods and the trees, they just think, oh, ick, itchy, you know, stuff drops out of the trees. How can anybody relax in a place like this? I want to be in a rowboat out in the middle of a lake with a sunset, you know, that's relaxing. You know, well, Bob wasn't in a rowboat at sunset. So everybody's park's different. But you have all these people that go to Bob's park and they meet at Bob's park and they do things. Well, they can do that because they've got this idea. Bob described it. Well, they can create that as well. And it doesn't mean they're making it up. That's what they see. That's how they interpret it. So
When you pass on your your IOUC goes back to the parent, as we were talking about earlier, and you discuss what you learned and where else you should go to learn more. Is that another virtual reality?
yes, that's another virtual reality. Yep, they're all virtual realities. It just has a different purpose and a different kind of rule set.
The interaction with the parent as well, like when you go back to, I guess, the larger consciousness system.
No, when you as a free will awareness unit you can say join, or you could say it has your data. You can just be deleted. You know, as a free will awareness unit can just go delete because all the data is already back there to the, you know, however you want to say that. You can say you're merged. You know, it sounds better to merge than it does to be deleted. That's but that's emotional thing. You know, it's the same idea. All the information gets back to the parent. The parent takes that and tries to learn what it can learn from it because it can compare that to other things and see patterns that otherwise you can't see just in a single lifetime. So you have that is kind of emerging. Now, this individual unit of consciousness stays an individual unit of consciousness. There's no need for it to merge. It's got more lives to do. It's learning. It's on this path.
Thank you.
Yes. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did.
So I guess we are at a close. Guys, I have enjoyed it. It's been fun. Thank you. You all are great. I really appreciate you coming. We got more people than we expected. You know, people had to bring in extra chairs and extra tables. I think that's wonderful.